This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Don Yarman from Oakland. I think we will get started on this. Thank you for joining us on the very first webinar that I personally have ever hosted, and I'm very pleased to have that happen with someone that I've long admired. Jessamyn West is a librarian and technologist living in rural Vermont who has been helping people with their computers for 25 years. She studies and writes about the digital divide and solves technology problems for schools and libraries. She's the author of Without a Net, Librarians Bridging the Digital Divide, and has blogged at librarian.net since 1999 and writes a column for computers and libraries. Jessamyn has given presentations about the intersection of libraries and technology around the United States and in Australia and Canada. You can learn more about Jessamyn's work at jessamyn.info. We're so happy to have her with us today to share 5 steps to better online privacy. Welcome, Jessamyn.
Thanks very much.
So give us a moment while we turn over the presentation to Jessamyn and get that up on your screen.
Fantastic. How are we doing? Look good?
Looks good to me.
Fantastic. If people can't see this, let me know. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about privacy. So this is a talk that I've given. It started out just as a basic, hey, I'll come to your library and talk about privacy for 30 minutes and then we'll have a conversation thing. And then the New England Library Association asked me to kind of do a, hey, how could we give a talk like this in our own libraries? Talk. And so this is kind of 2 talks in one, both a basic privacy talk, but also, hey, librarians, if you would like to give this talk yourself or some variety of it, I'll talk about what you need to know. And all of my slides are Creative Commons licensed. You can just have them. They're online at the link we gave up at the top to PowerPoint version, Keynote version, PDF version, and there's also a lot of links to places to go for more information, because obviously you're not gonna learn all the stuff in one day, but I feel like for some people there may be one direction or one facet of this that's super useful and relevant to them and their patrons, and so the links page has a lot more information that you can kind of delve into. So you're welcome to follow along on the web if you don't want to follow along here. And the other thing that I said is I can kind of keep half an eye on the chat window as I'm talking about this. So if you have a question, or especially if something I'm saying doesn't make sense, or I'm talking about a topic that you don't know what it is, please feel free to toss that in the chat. I can't guarantee that I'll see it right up front, but what I'd like to do is be explaining this in a way that's useful. And if I slip into jargon by mistake, obviously I would like to fix that. So this is pretty current. I keep this updated, or at least I try to, but obviously the privacy playing field changes fairly quickly. So one of the things about this talk is it's in some ways more conceptual, like here's things you should know about, and less specific, like here's how you need to change a Facebook setting, because obviously Facebook changes a lot. So the toolkit is the kind of talk within the talk, and that's just me. And in between the slides where I talk about the concepts, I'll have these blue slides that's kind of sideline advice for librarians, information that I've found is helpful when you're talking to patrons about this kind of thing. I've given this talk at a lot of small rural libraries in Vermont, some larger libraries in New England, and so things that are helpful for librarians to know as they're talking to their patrons, you'll see in blue. So in general, the way this talk goes is, I often tell people, you know, plan on an hour and a half, but usually it's, you know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes of me talking about a thing, 5 very basic steps, but then a lot of time to sort of have a conversation. It's really a combination of, hey, let me talk about some things that I know, and really like, hey, here's an opportunity for us to all get together and ask questions and talk about privacy concepts and internet safety concepts that are important. And then, of course, at the end, links. I probably don't have to tell you, but oh my gosh, having printable handouts, very helpful for a lot of people who may be digitally divided or just kind of internet timid. So having a piece of paper they can walk home with often solves a problem for people in a way that, you know, I aspire to the paperless office, but let's be honest, 2019, people still like to walk away with a piece of paper. So the first thing, before I talk about any steps, is just this concept of threat model, which of course sounds scary, but really what it is the idea that privacy and what you need out of privacy and internet safety varies depending on who you are. If you are a person who is, say, a doctor or a lawyer or somebody that has laws that govern how you keep people's information safe, you're going to care a lot more about how some of this stuff works than sort of your average person who doesn't care about privacy. And this is true for lots of different kinds of people. Maybe you have an uncertain immigration status. Maybe you're in a domestic situation that is not safe. Maybe you've got kids at home and you just want to keep them out of your computer and you want to understand how to do that. Lots of different things may be relevant to you. And so I always tell people, think about your own situation, not just what's perfect privacy, because what we'll be coming back to over and over again is perfect privacy isn't really something you can do. Like being on the internet is inherently riskier than being off the internet, but it has a lot of benefits, many, many benefits. And so if you're staying offline just because you're afraid, you're worried about privacy, or you're worried about safety, there may be ways we can help you with that so that you can get the benefits of internet interactions and not have to worry so much about the downsides. In general, the people that I work with who are patrons kind of don't know what they don't know. And so that's what we try to help them with. And so what's relevant to you, the library worker, is obviously understanding the laws of your jurisdiction, because that can vary state by state, although there are privacy laws on the books in every state. Other things that may conflict with that, it's worth understanding. Talking about best practices, not even so much like this is the #1 way to do this, but here are better ways. In fact, I think best practices is probably less good than better practices. Let's talk about ways that could improve upon what you're doing, but not like if you don't do it this one special way, you're doing it wrong. No one likes to hear that. And reasonable solutions, solutions that'll work for an average person leading an average life. You know, maybe somebody who's not particularly tech savvy, or maybe someone who can't pay for software, or maybe somewhere who realistically has a hectic life and not a lot of time to learn new stuff. We want to make solutions that work for them, not just try to wedge them into the box of doing it one special way. And it's hard. I'm not always great at being flexible, but I find often the more flexible I'm able to be, the more I can work with patrons who have a varying wide array of concerns. So the first thing I always talk about, I probably estimated in what I do with technology instruction, kind of helping people use their computers or learn to use their computers better, I probably spend between 20 and 30% of my time in some way dealing with passwords, either helping people remember passwords, helping people choose a password, describing the difference. Yesterday, even, I was at a drop-in time and I had a user whose email password didn't work, but in order to get into his password vault on his computer, we had to change his computer password. And it was very difficult for that person who's not super tech savvy, but has a computer and email, to sort of understand that those two passwords had nothing to do with one another. And that when we tried then to log into his wife's email password so that we could get the code that got sent, et cetera, that the fact that he couldn't log into his wife's account had nothing to do with either of those things. So in general, passwords and PINs are confusing for people, and it's very useful to have a way for people to remember them. I often spend a little bit of time explaining why they're complicated, explaining why we thought you should have long, complicated passwords, which was a best practice right up until a couple of years ago when we realized, safety and security people realized, that if you made people make a very complicated password and write it and change it every 3 months, what they would wind up doing is writing it down on a Post-it on their computer, which was exactly the opposite of private and or secure. And so I kind of explain that to users as kind of a like, look, there's reasons, you don't have to agree with them, but this is why we think that. And by and large, one of the most effective and important things I do in terms of helping users with passwords is encouraging them to write them down in a way that makes sense. And I know that that goes against, in many ways, best practices, but especially for older people or people with memory issues, etc., keeping passwords written down and updating them when you update the passwords is the #1 thing people can do to keep their stuff more private, because it means they have a password they'll remember and they can have a password that's more complicated. And if people worry about that kind of thing, I often tell them to think about a way to sort of generate passwords that maybe have some number in the middle that only they would remember. And then when they write down their password, they can just put blanks where they know they fill it in with a number, their pet's name, whatever the thing is, in case they don't feel comfortable having that written down. Now, obviously, it's more safe for people to use password managers. All the big internet browsers allow you to save passwords within the browser. That's great for people who only use one device. It's not that great for people who may have a mobile device and a desktop device that they move back and forth between. There are password managers, and there's a good link to that on my links page that'll allow you to manipulate passwords among devices, which is great, but it is kind of a second level thing. For people who struggle a little bit with computers, a password manager might be a step too far. The other thing I do is I talk to people about things like two-factor authentication, like when you log into a bank website and you need to not only enter your password, but maybe get a text on your phone. And I got to tell you, in rural Vermont where I live, two-factor authentication that relies on texting can be really complicated because people either don't have their phones, or one of the places I do drop-in doesn't actually have a good enough cell service that people can reliably get those. And so explaining to people before they go down the road of two-factor authentication, which you can get for your bank, you can get for your email, you can get for your Social Security Administration if you log into my Social Security website, that they want to make sure they have a method that works for them. For instance, I live in some place with kind of a not particularly great cell service, and so I have a little authenticator app that I run on my phone, which doesn't have to have a connection to the internet to give me a password that'll work on my phone. Now, this is a comic you may not be able to see super well on your webinar phone, but essentially it's an XKCD comic. And what it talks about is you make these passwords that are very difficult, and they wind up actually not being hard for a computer, and they're very hard for you to remember. Whereas something that isn't actually that difficult, like 4 words in your language strung together, a computer doesn't see that as 4 words the same way we see it with our human eyeballs. And so it's harder for a computer to get at and much easier for us to remember. So when I am trying to help people choose a password that'll satisfy the email or whatever, often we'll look at starting simple and then getting a little complicated, 4 words strung together, all 4 of your cat's names, and then an exclamation point at the end and a 0 in the middle. It feels like a hack, but if it helps people with reasonable passwords, very important. So the one thing I do think is important to stress is not reusing passwords too much, or what I tell people is I'll often have insecure password that I'll use for stuff like Pinterest, where I don't really care what happens to that password or even that account. And then secure longer passwords for stuff like my bank, my healthcare portal, anything that has to do with my private information that's really important to me. Because every time you see one of these hacks getting mentioned in the newspaper, you know, if Yahoo gets hacked and I have a Yahoo password, you know, I'll change my Yahoo password. But if Yahoo gets hacked and I use my Yahoo password for 10 other things, that potentially makes those 10 other things also vulnerable. And so I do explain to people what I do. I have secure passwords, I have insecure passwords. That helps them feel more comfortable and confident, which is really a lot of what we're doing is just confidence. And then we move forward to help them do stuff. And again, think about threat models. How safe does this need to be? How private does this need to be? And sometimes websites will just kind of end run you and make you have a really complicated password for something that maybe they don't need it for. I do mention to librarians, if you're in charge of a system, like, you know, somebody wants to leave a comment on a blog, let's say, on your system, or, you know, logging into the library catalog. If your system is requiring an incredibly hard password for something that's not necessarily mission critical security, you may be keeping users from using it. And that's a, you know, a user experience challenge to think about. Our library blog at the library that I work at required incredibly strong passwords just to leave a comment or to log in. And as a result, people didn't engage with our content in a way that they might have if they'd been able to use simpler passwords. I know it's important to use good passwords, but it's also important to think about how very strong passwords can also be a hurdle, particularly for digitally divided users. So the next topic I usually talk about is the idea of internet traffic, right? So I'm on a computer. One of the things you often see privacy and security people say, we've got the state of Vermont has like an Office of Technology and they have a Twitter account, which is good. And they, you know, send little tidbits of tiny privacy tips for people. But one of their privacy tips for people, actually two, I guess, one of them is never log into your bank using public Wi-Fi, which, okay. Repeat the active information for two-factor authentication. Sorry, just saw that. The big thing about, sorry, going back because of a, the big thing about two-factor authentication is a lot of times it will require you to text like a code to a phone. And if you don't have cell service, that can be a problem. Many things will allow you to use an authenticator application. I use one that's called Google Authenticator that runs on my phone. You can run it on Android or iPhone. And if a place will allow you to run an actual authenticator thing, it just generates like a time-based code. And what that means is you don't have to have an active cell connection. And as long as you've linked whatever the phone is, so it has to be the user's phone, but as long as you've linked whatever the phone is to the application previous to that, people can authenticate for two-factor authentication without having to have a cell signal or necessarily access to their email, which is the other problem. You know, we're like, we emailed a code, and people are like, but my email computer's at home. So it's an app called Google Authenticator, and there's 2 or 3 others that you can get. You're welcome. So one of the things these State of Vermont group did is, you know, never log into your bank through public Wi-Fi, which is good best practice, but maybe not realistic if you're somebody who doesn't have home Wi-Fi, as a really good example. And they also do say things like, you know, never post pictures on social media that indicates that you're not at home, because then, I don't know, people could break into your house. And one of the things that's kind of tricky about that is what it means is for people who are digitally divided or have a less good connection to the internet, they wind up being afraid of behavior that for a lot of us, like, of course you put a picture on social media when you're on vacation, for a lot of us is normal. And it reminds me of kind of when I was a young woman and I got my own phone. landline phone. And my mother said, well, make sure you don't put your name in the phone book. I have a female first name, because people go through the phone book looking for women's names to harass them. And like, maybe that happened. Maybe that was a true thing that happened. It certainly didn't happen to me. But what it meant was that my mother was saying, because of who you are, you need to interact differently with the world of telephones, let's say, than everyone else. And maybe that's not advice that's helpful, or maybe it's just advice that makes you worry, but doesn't help make you safer. And so I do sort of talk to people about, hey, if you're using public Wi-Fi to do stuff, that's a normal thing to do, but there are ways to make your computer safer. We talk a little bit about internet traffic, what's happening when you're using a computer with a browser, that it makes requests to the internet for content that comes back in, and that there's a little trail, usually on the computer, just, a cache of kind of where you've been. If you're sort of operating well in a library, you clear out a patron's record of where they've been after they're done using the computer. But patrons should know that about their own personal computers as well. But also every internet browser, so Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, they all have a private browsing option, which means less information about where you've been stays on the computer that you're using. So in case you're using a public computer and you're concerned about that, and this doesn't have to be for people who want to break the law or do nefarious stuff. It can just be like, look, I'm on Amazon shopping for birthday presents, and I share this computer with the person having a birthday. I don't want it to keep track of where I've been, so I have private browsing turned on. In the list of links that I have, it will explain sort of how to get into that. But we talk a little bit about what stays on the computer and what happens with your traffic. And so for online banking or like health portals or things, you just want to make sure you're making a secure connection. 3 or 4 years ago, this may have been a thing that was less certain, but especially in the last year or two, Google made a big change in how it deals with websites. And you know how a web address starts http:// blah, blah, blah. It decided to prioritize sites that you could connect to securely. And then securely means the traffic that's going over the internet is encrypted end to end, basically. I know this is a little hand wavy. If this is a topic you're interested in, there's links where you can learn more. And so web addresses that start with HTTPS would have higher rank in Google because they were trying to sort of force people to have a more secure connection. And so what I tell people is, if you're logging into a website that allows or that has HTTPS at the beginning, that's actually a secure connection. And even if you're using public Wi-Fi, you're probably, and again, probably is always going to be sort of the lesson of the day, you're probably fine. Now, for people who really have privacy concerns, higher threat models that they really need to worry about, you might want to get a VPN, which is a virtual private network, which allows you to connect directly to another computer and send all your traffic in and out of that computer, or Tor, which is an entirely sort of alternative internet that not only has your information, not only is your information sort of encrypted, but it takes a different route through the internet. Again, this is a little bit hand wavy, but what it means is all of the information, all of the packets that are getting transferred between your computer and the other computer you want to connect to are kind of scrambled, so there's no way to kind of reconnect that. And when I talk about VPNs, well, Jerry has a great question. Are any VPNs actually trustworthy? One of the big issues with VPNs in a general sense is they're only as trustworthy as the people who are running the VPNs. You can go to a website like Wirecutter that'll actually review VPNs and give you a little bit more information about how trustworthy they are, who runs them. I think a lot of people are used to the VPN situation where they have to connect to one for work. The example that I use often in library situations is, let's say I want to watch something on the BBC, and the BBC allows their content to be viewed by anybody with a UK IP address, but not a US IP address. And so I could use something like TunnelBear, which is a VPN that's been around a long time. I don't know if they're entirely trustworthy, but all I want to do is watch TV in the UK. And that would be a way I could, slightly fake who I am to solve a problem for me. There's a lot of debate in the online world about VPNs and their trustworthiness. And my personal answer is I'm not sure. And so what I usually do is I check other sources, again, Wirecutter, but also sort of security experts, Krebs on Security, Bruce Schneider, or whatever. I would be hesitant to trust a VPN with something that was really important, but if I'm just trying to watch TV in another country, that would be fine with me. So HTTPS is a thing that we talk to our library patrons about. Look for the S. You can feel secure with that S. If you're running a library, one of the things you can offer is browsing and browser choices that allow you the most security or information for people about how they can use private browsing if they want to. Our library offers Tor, and Tor is complicated because Tor is a network, but it's also an internet browser. We offer the Tor internet browser as an option on our computers. It's slow. It's not a great browser, except if privacy is your #1 concern, but it is available to people, and it's not so much that we have it available as that it basically allows us to have a conversation about that kind of thing. And Virginia has a question about how would patrons use a VPN on library computers? Depends on how the library computer is set up. Generally speaking, I think you can't if you can't change the network settings on that computer. I'm not sure if it's a thing you could do, say, with a thumb drive, but I think for library computers, it would be something the library would have to offer as an option, not that I think a patron could use it. I think there's ways of using what are called proxy servers, meaning you send all your traffic through another website. Kids used to do this in order to be able to get around like school internet blocks. You can log into a proxy server and then put a web address into that server to be able to read the content from that website. It's a little sort of inside baseball. I think it's one of those things, if you have a patron who has that kind of question, you can sort of move forward from there. But in general, the library's network can be, in a sense, its own kind of VPN setup, and you can let people know kind of who you have your internet service with, how you connect, who's sort of looking at that network. And the other things libraries can do are keeping your own network as secure as you can and making sure your browsers are sort of what I call clean and safe, meaning they don't have malware attached to them. There's a lot of weird stuff that can kind of attach itself to Chrome in a weird way. Like, I'm used to Firefox and checking for add-ons, and if there aren't any, being like, okay, we're good. But with Chrome, it's a little bit more complicated. And so I always tell people, make sure you understand how to keep your browsers looking good and giving people multiple browser options if they want, because there's still, despite the fact that it's 2019, things that do and do not work in different browsers. Now, this is more something for patrons to think about in their homes, a little less kind of what librarians need to think about in their library environment. But these devices, listening and recording devices, both on people's phones like Hey Siri and Hey Google, but also these things like Amazon Echo, the Google Dot, the HomePod that Apple has, which is a speaker, but it also listens to you. You know, all of these devices may be kind of on and kind of listening at all times. And one of the things we've kind of learned over time is that companies who own these devices may or may not be kind of paying attention to what happens. Now, in my world, I don't worry about this a lot, but again, my threat model is low and I can't make that choice for everyone else. So, and this also includes like smart TVs. So one of the things I talk about to people is like, look, number one, I know you've been reading about smart TVs or smart microwaves or smart refrigerators, but let's be clear, if your device isn't online, it's not sending information about you to the internet. It's not spying on you. I think the other thing when we think about this topic is like Ring, those like internet doorbells, where it's not just who comes to your house, but they're actually kind of have a camera on the street. And it is a way for people to think about like, hey, it's not just your doorbell, it's something that might be photographing people on the street. Now, most of the people in my environment do not have these devices, but it's definitely worth kind of a conversation about, hey, if it's listening for your voice, if you've got an Android phone that's listening for Hey Google, that kind of means its microphone is always on. And that's worth paying attention to. If you're a library, if you're a person that works in a library, that's something to pay attention to in terms of your patrons' privacy. And if it's your patrons or they have these devices at home and they have questions, usually there's ways of turning this on or off. Like I like Siri, I like talking to my phone and having it answer questions, but I set it up so there's a mechanical, like there's a button I press to turn Siri on. It's not just listening to me while I talk to you, talk to my friends, et cetera, et cetera. And so we do talk a little bit about what these devices are, and we talk a little bit about what the concerns are. So like Samsung, which when I originally had written this talk, had just gotten a bunch of devices. Is it true on your camera, on your computer? Asks Maria. I don't know. People have thoughts about this. Theoretically, your camera on your computer or your phone has to, light up an indicator if they are recording, paying attention, or on. There have been concerns, and there have definitely been people talking like at hacker conferences that there are ways to manipulate this which are not, strictly speaking, kosher and would not have those usual indicators. My general feeling is the camera on your computer isn't on unless it says it's on, except in extreme cases. But I keep a little sticker on top of my camera just in case, because I prefer somebody not looking into my home unless I want them to be. In fact, for a lot of people, they talk about this with like web conferencing, right? You use a Zoom web conference, and as soon as you join a discussion, your camera's on, right? Which, okay, I mean, I can understand why that's a good user experience to not have to twiddle with it or figure out how to turn it on. But if you're not expecting it, suddenly your camera's on and it's looking at you. And so I always think it's kind of useful hygiene to cover your camera. And I kind of feel like way back in the early days of the post office, everybody sent postcards, right? And then at some point, somebody was like, maybe I don't want everybody reading my mail. And they started using envelopes. And at first, it was just people using envelopes were perceived to be, weird privacy creeps with something to hide. But now we all kind of put our mail in envelopes and we don't really think about it. I find more often than not, people have the cameras on their laptops and they're maybe not their phones, just covered just because they're not sure. And I never think it's a bad idea to try that. So, oops, sorry, let me go back. So Samsung, which had all those devices that caught on fire, one of the things that's really interesting about this is, Samsung they do tablets and phones, and they have this as part of the terms of service that nobody uses. Please be aware if your spoken words include personal or other sensitive information, that information will be captured and transmitted to a third party through your use of voice recognition. And the reason I emphasize that is, maybe you trust the person who makes your phone, right? Like I use a lot of Apple products. I have okay feelings about Apple. I might even trust Apple with my stuff. But if Apple makes a deal with some other company to deal with how my voice is processed, suddenly my voice may be somewhere that I'm not expecting it to be. And that's also worth people thinking about, that you're never sure where this information is going to go. So for people who are privacy conscious, it's a good idea to be sort of careful. And the last thing I mentioned in terms of this category is the idea of cameras in libraries. Now, again, I'm in a rural area. We do not have cameras in almost any libraries except the biggest ones in the state. And I feel personally, and this is literally just me personally, Jessamyn, having a camera in a library kind of creeps me out. I understand why people would do it. I think it's a personal choice that is a completely reasonable thing to do in various library situations, but I feel observed and I am concerned. And I saw, I don't know if you can see this picture, but it's a library that I visited in Massachusetts. They have a poster that says this library is a safe space, but then they also have this notice that there's video surveillance. And to me, those two topics conflict. For other people, those two are hand in hand. They feel safer in a library where they feel that there are cameras so that people are unlikely to try stuff, corner them in the stacks, be weird and creepy. And so one of the things we talk about in general, and is worth knowing kind of as a library worker, that there's privacy but also safety implications for cameras, and people really do have a wide number of feelings about them. I presumed a lot of people would feel how I did with cameras in libraries, and it turns out they don't. And so thinking as a library about Internet of Things, things that you get if you have a TV, it's very hard to not buy a smart TV nowadays, but thinking about how far you go with that, right on down to if you've got an Android phone in your pocket, if it's listening for Hey Google, it's listening, and it's worth understanding that in your library environment. And the more people can understand the choices that they're making, the more they can make choices that work for them. Privacy is a very personal thing in a lot of ways. And so helping a user understand the environment so that they can make their proper choices is, I think, really kind of the right path. One of the things a lot of people I feel like do at least have heard of before in terms of computers is the idea of tracking, right? The idea that there's cookies on your computer, they maybe don't understand what they are, and they're definitely not sure what they're doing. And I have this story that I love. I went to eBags, doing one of those like late night, I need a new bag shops. And I was looking around for a little roller bag, and I found this funny, weird roller bag that was that had a New York Jets logo on it. And I don't know if you know anything about sports, but the New York Jets are not particularly good at football. And this bag was really, really cheap, which is great. And so I like put it in my shopping cart, but then I'm like, I'll see tomorrow if I'm interested in this thing still. And so forgot about it. Next day, 2 days later, I'm like reading the New York Times or the Atlantic or something online that I don't see ads for. And there's an eBags ad, which is not that surprising. They have lots of ads. But the picture that was in the eBags ad was a New York Jets rolly bag. And like, that's not a coincidence. That's because eBags and the New York Times probably share an ad agency that can transfer or read what are called third-party cookies. So eBay or eBags puts a cookie on my computer, little piece of information that says what I was up to. It can include stuff like shopping carts information. But then the New York Times was able to read that. And so when browsers are asking, hey, do you want to allow third-party cookies? What I'm explaining to patrons is third-party cookies are really, hey, do you want the New York Times to be able to show an ad for eBags? It's that kind of thing, triangulating. One of the things I let people know is there's a lot of stuff you can control just by using a browser plugin. And the most important thing about browser plugins is how simple they are. So this is the only time when I'm giving this talk where I'll drop into demo mode. And I'm like, let's watch how quickly and easily I install an ad blocker on my Firefox web browser. So we navigate to, I don't even remember the web address, but it's written on the list of links. We click the button that says, do you want to install it? We click the button that says, are you sure? And then presto, I'm suddenly blocking advertising on most websites, and it's very simple. I think a lot of people believe that there's some kind of coding involved to do that kind of thing, and I just want to let them know that it's not. So the tools are fairly straightforward, and I have a short list of them that I think are really privacy enhancing tools. AdBlock Plus is one of them. This one with the little critter is called Privacy Badger. It's made from the by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It can not only help block some ads, but a lot of third-party cookies and also kind of weird long-term cookies. And these work in Firefox. There's versions of some of them for Chrome. Edge is, I think, the holdout, the one that you don't see as many plugins that work for them. HTTPS everywhere. Like you might notice at the top of this chat, the web address they gave for my talk is http:// blah, blah, blah. But there's actually a secure version of that page. Doesn't really matter because there's no login or anything. But HTTPS everywhere would allow you to get the secure version of a page if there is. And I don't talk too much about social software in this talk because, again, it's like a broad strokes kind of thing. But there are plugins both for browsers and within social software that can help you. Don, don't worry about it. Everything's great. I think when you copy it from the browser, it doesn't have the S in it. But there are plugins for social software. My favorite is one called FB Purity. FB stands for Facebook, but they're not allowed to call it Facebook. They can actually help block ads, games. You can keyword block stuff on Facebook. Now, the downside of this is it'll only work on your desktop or laptop. You can't install this on a phone or a tablet, which is too bad because so many people are interacting on mobile. But if you do browse Facebook on a desktop, you can basically block mentions of words. You can block baby pictures if that's your thing. You can block pet pictures if that's your thing. You can block political posts if that's your thing. But you can use it to control your environment, which is terrific. Similarly, this other thing on the side, allowing comments from, that's an Instagram privacy setting that's kind of buried. But you can only allow comments on your Instagram from like people you follow, for example. And that can really cut down on noise, especially for people who do stuff that's a little bit more controversial, whatever controversial means on social software. And this last thing is kind of a joke with me, but like I use Twitter. I like Twitter. Twitter is fun for me. Twitter has many problems. Among them, lots of white nationalists use Twitter in order to not only talk to each other, but harass people on Twitter. This is a problem. And Twitter doesn't really do that much about it, especially in our country. But in Germany, where sort of Nazis and white nationalists are actually against the law, you can see a Twitter that is free of these people. And so literally, if this is your problem, if you post a lot of political stuff on Twitter and what you need to do is see fewer Nazis and white nationalists, if you tell Twitter you live in Germany, you will suddenly not see those posts. And the only reason I mention this is not because I think your patrons are going to be set upon by white nationalists, but to let people know there's more that they can control than maybe they think. So Virginia has a question about using browser settings to block cookies. I think that is a great place to start. I think there's a kind of an open debate in the library community about how much installing something like ad blocker on a library computer is appropriate for a number of reasons, but I think that's a healthy debate. But if you set up a browser to not allow, for example, third-party cookies, so the kind that I described, you kind of maximize value of not having ad agencies track you around the internet, and it's a pretty low inconvenience. Like every now and again, Privacy Badger winds up blocking a thing that breaks something I'm trying to interact with, and that can be a little bit of a hassle. I don't mind, because I don't mind getting under the hood and messing with it. But by and large, your patrons just want to use a computer to do something else. They don't want to fuss with the computer. So I think using browser settings is great. And you can do this on every internet browser, which is great. And this slide, I tell people, if there is one thing people go home and do of all the things, DuckDuckGo is an alternative internet search engine. It's like Google, except it doesn't spy on you. There's a lot of information you can read about it if you don't know much about DuckDuckGo. I've started using it as my default browser, both on my desktop machine and my phone. It's a slightly less good search, partly because it doesn't know who I am and where I am and what I've searched for before, but it's definitely a privacy conscious way to do internet searching. And for a lot of our patrons, like, they don't care. They use the search to just get to whatever it is that they want to get to. And so especially on a library computer, having DuckDuckGo be the default search, both in a browser, but also, in the search bar, if you have it, can be a real privacy forward move. And I love this app. Plus, little duck wearing a bow tie. It's cute, right? And so if you need to learn more about these topics, and it's kind of a joke, right? I'm like, Google is your friend, only because DuckDuckGo is your friend was confusing. But I often, if I'm trying to Google or look up or DuckDuckGo a complicated privacy topic, I will often use the EILI5, which is kind of Reddit speak for explain it like I'm 5. If I think something is just going to be too complicated for me, like I don't understand what IPv6 is, you can go and type into a search engine, like whatever the concept is, IPv6, and then EILI5, and you will probably find a very simple explainer in very simple English that can help you understand it. And anytime an app tells you it cares about your privacy, just assume it's lying to you. And I often tell people the most important thing is to model behavior for users that you think is useful, right? So if you're telling people to use DuckDuckGo, use DuckDuckGo yourself. If you're telling people Privacy Badger is useful, try installing it and see how it works for you. And so the last thing, and this is really almost more of a concept than sort of a tool, is the whole idea of, trust in general, but verify in general. So Google, when you search it for people's names, a lot of times will pop up a little knowledge box on the side with more information about the person. And most of the time, this is helpful. It'll link you to the Wikipedia page. A whole bunch of great stuff will happen. But sometimes it gets confused. And so, like in this case, there's Bill Evans, who's a jazz saxophonist, but also William Evans, Bill Evans, who's a pianist, but also William Evans, who's a saxophonist, who was with Miles Davis in the 80s. These are two separate people, but because their names are similar and they're both kind of white dudes with glasses, Google smushes them together in the knowledge box because Google is actually a dumb computer / calculator, and I'm a human being with a human brain and human eyeballs that can kind of realize this is not true. Like, he didn't play with the Miles Davis group in the 80s if he also died in 1980. And so I often tell people the last part of this whole equation is your own ideas. I think, this current administration throws around the idea of fake news just to kind of foment confusion. And so helping people figure out how they can get more information. Wikipedia is fine. The references on Wikipedia are great. Reading, it's like we tell people, like, health information from Mayo Clinic better than health information from WebMD. And the same thing is true about information that you sort of get online. Links in email from strangers, don't click them. New friend trying to friend you on Facebook, but you thought you were already friends with them, don't friend them. Computer popping something up that tells you there's something suddenly wrong and you have to call this number, doesn't happen. Now, I know that because I've been using computers for years and years and years and years, but for some of your patrons or even some of your staff, that information may not be a foregone conclusion. And so being confident and explaining that kind of stuff instead of kind of what I used to do more of, and I was like, well, there's some risk, but really what people need to hear is either there's not a lot of risk with that, or yeah, that's actually something you should think about instead of being like kind of both sidism and being like, well, sometimes pop-ups can give you useful information. Not really, they kind of don't. I teach people how to hover over a link to see where it goes. You can do that on your phone as well as on your desktop. So if you get a weird email from your bank that seems kind of strange, I show them how to look to see where that link goes that they're asking you to click on, or on your phone, or just how to like be like, this doesn't sound like my bank. I'm just going to call my bank, right? I don't love making phone calls, but a lot of times phone calls will straighten this thing out. And one of the most important parts of all of this is talking to other people about it so that you can learn more. These talks can be really good because we can all chat about these topics, and other people learning from their friends and other patrons is almost more powerful than them learning from me, because they think I kind of know stuff in a way that they don't. Now, I don't think that's true necessarily, but it's a lot better to have sort of neighbor people talking to neighbors than to have me just kind of orate about it. This is a kind of a fun quiz people can try. It's a couple years old at this point, so it's a little bit out of date. But after you give a talk like this, people can take kind of a 10-question test, or you can lead off with it, honestly, to see what they know about cybersecurity to start with. And it's our friends at Pew Research, so it's kind of legit. And the last thing I try to sort of send people away with is ultimately there's no such thing as perfect privacy unless you live in this little hut in the mountains, as nice as that sounds like. But it doesn't mean you can't get a little better with doing privacy stuff that you care about. And I feel like in the library world, one of the most important gifts we have to give is helping people feel better and more confident about whatever choice they're making for their lives, right? Like the classic thing for me is, I live in a rural town in Vermont. I don't lock my door. That makes sense for me personally. I would never tell somebody else that they just had to not lock their door because I do it and it's fine. Like, I'm taking a risk. I've decided that risk is appropriate, and that's how I live my life. Other people have to kind of think about what works for their lives, make their choices, and then part of our job is to really help them feel like they made an informed choice so that they can feel confident that they're doing what works for them. At the end of the day, this is actually a little ancient postcard of the library that I work at. At the end of the day, having them have you as a person who can help them with the questions they have is going to help them be safer and more private online. So if people have questions, we have a little bit more time, but my email address is right here, jessamyn@gmail.com, and I'm always happy to talk to or chit chat with people about privacy topics in case you have something that sort of comes up later. I encourage you to take a look at, I'm just going to show you what the screen looks like, to take a look at the webpage that I have, which has these slides, a text version of this talk in case sort of I blah, blah, blah fast past something you wanted. But then each of the slides I have has a section with more links to read, more information about threat models, passwords, internet traffic, recording devices, other tracking and plugins, as well as other things you want to read as you move forward. The New York Times has this great privacy project that also has a newsletter. They'll kind of drop something in your inbox maybe once a week with information about what's going on currently in the world of privacy. So my email again is Jessamyn, just my first name, @gmail.com. Feel free to keep in touch, and feel free to take and use any of this that might help you help your patrons with practical privacy. Thanks very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions in the time we have left.
Thanks, Jessamyn. That was great. I really loved getting the tour of the resources on the Practical Internet Privacy website. I've gone through it myself. FB Purity changed my life, so it's really nice. And I like how you started your talk with looking at your own personal threat assessment, because that's fundamentally where most the recognized cybersecurity frameworks begin with, just sort of recognizing your own, kind of what your biggest like threats and exposure model are, and addressing those.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's super important to understand about that and threat models, I mean, threat models sound scary, but it doesn't have to be. There's probably a better way to put it, is that if you just kind of read cybersecurity experts, and I read some of them, but not many, they seem to assume that everybody really needs the best privacy options available without kind of understanding that there's a friction, I think, for lack of a word, between the best privacy you can get slash afford and realistic things that'll work for people's real lives. And that's the thing that I think a library worker can really help with, is saying, sure, there's ways of doing it if you were somebody who wanted to overthrow the Egyptian government, but it's a completely different thing if you're an empty nester living with your partner who you trust and the two of you share a computer and an email address. You may want to do things differently, and that's okay, and in fact, even appropriate.
I did
Oh, and
see
I guess I should also mention there's a Google document that's linked at the top, which takes that page that's kind of designy and turns it into a handout that you can literally print. I mean, take your name off it and put my name on it. Like, put your own name on it. I don't care, whatever you want. But if you wanted a handout, there's a linked Google document handout that, again, you can have and give to people if you want to.
I saw that Virginia did ask whether the link to the quiz you mentioned is on the page. Is it included?
Yep. Yep, it is in the trust but verify section at the end. It's the second link. It's called the Cybersecurity Knowledge Quiz. And you can
Fantastic.
try it yourself. It's a little out of date, but I think in general it's still fairly accurate. And the thing that's interesting about it is it lets you see how you did compared to the other people who took that quiz. So people can kind of feel whether their cybersecurity knowledge is average, above average, below average, and that can help them assess maybe what kind of work they want to do moving forward.
Okay, Jessamyn, thank you again for this terrific talk, and thanks everyone for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at Open. We're at support@open.ohio.gov, and thanks very much for attending our webinar.
Great. Thanks everyone for your attention and your time.